My name is Olivia Marsh. I'm 32 years old. For the past 3 years, my parents have told our entire extended family, anyone who'd listen at holidays and reunions, that I moved back near my brother Ethan because I couldn't support myself, that I'd been living off his generosity ever since. I never corrected it publicly. I let the story stand, because arguing with my parents about money had never once, in 32 years, actually changed their minds about anything. 2 weeks ago, at a family gathering, my aunt asked Ethan directly how he'd managed to be so generous with me for 3 years running. Ethan set down his drink, looked at her, and said, "I think you've got that backwards." Then he pulled out his phone, opened his banking app, and showed her 3 years of transfers, all going one direction. From me to him. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever let a false story about you stand because correcting it felt exhausting, comment "I understand" below. This one's for you. Ethan is 4 years younger than me, and for most of our adult lives, our relationship has existed in a specific, quiet closeness that our parents, I think, never fully understood or appreciated, given how differently they've always treated each of us. I want to describe the shape of that difference, because I think it matters to understanding how the false narrative about our finances eventually took root so easily. Ethan had always been considered, within our family, the more naturally capable one, steady, practical, someone who seemed to move through life's milestones with an ease that our parents openly admired. I'd taken a more winding path, changing careers twice in my 20s before finally settling into a stable, if unglamorous, role in medical billing that I'd built, slowly and deliberately, into genuine financial independence. Our parents' narrative about our relative competence had calcified early and never really updated, regardless of how much evidence eventually contradicted it. By the time this story takes place, I'd been financially stable for nearly 6 years. My parents' understanding of me, apparently, hadn't caught up. I want to describe, specifically, what those 2 winding career changes in my 20s actually looked like, because I think the specific texture of that period matters to understanding exactly how my parents' assumption originally took root, however outdated it eventually became. I'd started my career in a marketing role that turned out to be a poor fit, moved into event coordination for about 18 months before that industry's instability during a broader economic downturn eliminated my position, and finally landed, at 26, in medical billing, a field I'd initially considered a temporary stopgap that turned out to suit my specific skills and interests considerably better than either of my earlier attempts. Ethan, by contrast, had gone directly from college into a logistics coordination role at a company he'd stayed with, moving up steadily, for the better part of a decade. I understand, looking back, why our parents' early impression of each of us had solidified the way it did during those specific years. What I don't understand, and never fully will, is why that impression never updated even after 6 full years of my own demonstrated stability. 3 years before this story begins, I relocated to the same city where Ethan had settled after college, a decision I made for reasons that had nothing to do with financial dependency and everything to do with wanting to be closer to my brother, whose company I genuinely enjoyed, and to a job market that offered better opportunities in my specific field than where I'd been living previously. I want to be direct about the actual mechanics of that move, because the contrast with my parents' eventual narrative matters enormously. I found my own apartment, signed my own lease, and paid my own security deposit and first month's rent entirely from savings I'd built over the preceding years. Ethan helped me move boxes over a single weekend, the same way any sibling might help another sibling relocate. That weekend of help, as far as I can tell, became the entire factual basis for 3 years of my parents describing me as dependent on him. I remember the specific details of that weekend clearly, in part because I've had reason to replay it so many times since, trying to understand how such an ordinary event became the foundation for such a persistent misunderstanding. Ethan and his then-girlfriend helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs to my new apartment. We ordered pizza that evening, and I remember him joking, as we finally collapsed onto my bare mattress surrounded by unopened boxes, that I owed him big time for the help, an obvious, throwaway joke between siblings that I now suspect, though I can't prove definitively, may have been the actual seed of the entire subsequent narrative, repeated by one of us at a family dinner and taken considerably more literally than either of us ever intended. I want to trace, as best I can reconstruct it, how this narrative actually began, because I think understanding its origin matters to understanding why it proved so durable despite having so little basis in fact. At a family dinner shortly after my move, my mother asked, in front of several relatives, how I was managing the transition to a new city. I'd mentioned, casually, that Ethan had been a great help with the move itself, nothing more specific than that. My mother, for reasons I still don't fully understand, seemed to seize on this comment and expand it, over subsequent retellings at other gatherings, into something considerably larger than what I'd actually said. By the following year's holiday gathering, I overheard my mother telling my aunt that I'd needed Ethan's help getting back on my feet, language that bore only the faintest resemblance to the actual, mundane truth of one weekend spent carrying boxes. I want to be honest about why I let this narrative continue for 3 years without directly challenging it, because I think the specific exhaustion behind that choice matters to understanding the rest of this story. I'd learned, over decades of experience, that correcting my parents' characterizations of me rarely produced any actual change in their underlying beliefs. My mother, in particular, seemed to have a specific narrative about each of her children that she'd settled into early and defended reflexively against any contradicting evidence, Ethan as the capable one, me as the one who needed help. Pointing out factual inaccuracies in this narrative had, in my experience, typically resulted in my mother doubling down rather than reconsidering, framing any pushback from me as further evidence of the very insecurity or defensiveness she'd already decided characterized me. I chose, instead, simply to live my actual life honestly, assuming, perhaps naively, that the truth of my genuine financial independence would eventually become self-evident without requiring direct confrontation. I want to describe one particular incident from partway through these 3 years, because I think it illustrates exactly how corrosive it felt, in the specific moment, to sit quietly through a mischaracterization rather than correcting it. At a cousin's baby shower, roughly 2 years into this pattern, a distant relative I barely knew struck up a conversation with me, apparently under the impression, based on whatever version of events had reached her secondhand, that I was going through some kind of ongoing financial hardship. She offered, with genuine kindness, to pass along a job listing at her own company, gently suggesting that a fresh start might help me get back on my feet the way Ethan has clearly been helping. I remember the specific, disorienting effort of deciding, in that moment, whether to correct her directly or simply thank her and change the subject. I chose the latter, as I usually did, telling myself it wasn't worth the awkwardness of explaining, to someone I barely knew, the actual complicated truth of a narrative that had nothing to do with her. I drove home from that shower feeling a specific, hollow exhaustion I couldn't fully articulate at the time, the accumulated weight of being perceived, by relative strangers, as someone I simply wasn't, based entirely on a story I'd never actually told myself. I want to lay out, plainly, what the actual financial relationship between Ethan and me looked like during these 3 years, because the gap between this reality and my parents' narrative is the entire point of this story. About 18 months after my move, Ethan had gone through a difficult stretch, a company layoff that had left him unemployed for nearly 4 months, a period during which his savings had dwindled considerably faster than he'd anticipated. During that stretch, I'd helped him with several months of rent, an arrangement we'd agreed to privately, with Ethan insisting on a repayment plan once he found new work, which he'd followed through on completely once he was employed again. Beyond that specific period, I'd also helped him with a security deposit on a better apartment the following year, again as a loan he'd repaid in full, and had covered several shared expenses over the years, group gifts for our parents, contributions toward a family trip, that, when totaled, represented a meaningful, if unremarkable, pattern of financial support flowing considerably more often from me to him than the reverse. I want to describe Ethan's unemployment period in more detail, because I think it's directly relevant to understanding exactly how backward my parents' narrative about our relationship had become. Ethan had been laid off from a mid-sized logistics company during a round of restructuring that affected nearly a third of his department, a layoff that had nothing to do with his own performance and everything to do with broader company financial difficulties. He'd searched diligently for new work throughout those 4 months, but the specific niche he'd built his career around had a limited job market in our city, extending his search considerably longer than either of us had initially anticipated. During those months, I'd covered a portion of his rent 3 separate times, transfers I'd made without any fanfare or expectation of public acknowledgement, understanding it simply as what siblings do for each other during genuine hardship. Ethan had kept careful track of these amounts himself, insisting, once he found new employment, on a specific repayment schedule that he'd honored completely over the following year. I want to describe, in more specific detail, what those 4 months of Ethan's unemployment actually felt like from my perspective, because I think the lived texture of that period matters to understanding how absurd it later felt to hear our mother characterize the situation in exactly the opposite direction. I remember the specific phone call when Ethan first told me about the layoff, his voice carrying a controlled panic he rarely allowed himself to show. I remember sitting down with him, that same week, to look honestly at his savings and his monthly expenses, helping him build a realistic budget for how long he could sustain himself without new income before needing outside help. I remember the specific discomfort, for both of us, of the conversation where I first offered to cover a portion of his rent, Ethan's initial reluctance to accept, my own insistence that this was exactly what family support was supposed to look like, the eventual agreement we reached together about how we'd track and eventually repay the amounts involved. None of this happened publicly, none of it was ever mentioned at family gatherings, which I think is part of why our mother's parallel narrative, describing the situation in the opposite direction, was able to persist so completely unchallenged by anyone who might have actually known the truth. I want to describe how my parents' narrative about our financial relationship continued, seemingly unaffected by any of the actual events unfolding in real life, throughout this entire period. Even during Ethan's unemployment, a period during which I was, factually, the one providing financial support, my mother continued describing our relationship, at family gatherings, in language that framed me as the dependent party. I remember overhearing her tell a cousin, during exactly the month I'd made my first rent contribution to Ethan, that she hoped I was finally getting more self-sufficient now that Ethan's been so patient with me. I want to be honest about how genuinely disorienting this was to witness, a narrative so thoroughly detached from actual events that it seemed to exist entirely independent of anything happening in reality, sustained purely by my mother's early, calcified assumption about which of her children needed help and which one provided it. I want to describe a conversation Ethan and I had, roughly 18 months into this pattern, once I'd finally decided to name, at least privately to him, how strange I found our parents' persistent narrative. "Does it bother you," I asked him, "that Mom tells people I'm the one depending on you? Given everything that's actually happened?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering the question. "Honestly, I've noticed it," he said. "I think I've let it go because correcting Mom about anything usually turns into a whole production I don't have the energy for. But yeah, it's strange, hearing her describe things so backward from how they actually are." "I felt the same way," I told him. "I just don't know if it's worth the fight to correct it." We agreed, in that conversation, to simply let it continue, both of us understanding, from decades of experience, the specific exhaustion of trying to update our parents' settled narratives about either of us. I want to describe a separate conversation I had, around this same period, with my partner, Daniel, who'd witnessed several of these mischaracterizations directly at family gatherings and had his own outside perspective on the pattern. "I don't understand how your mom keeps saying this," he told me, one evening after a particularly frustrating holiday dinner where the topic had come up yet again. "You've shown me your own budget. You've never once asked either of us for money. I've watched you send Ethan actual transfers with my own eyes. How does she keep saying the opposite?" "I think she decided something a long time ago," I told him, and updating it would require admitting she'd been wrong, publicly, for years. "I think that's harder for her than just continuing to believe the version she already has." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I think you're being more patient with this than I would be," he said. "I get why you don't want the fight. But I think, at some point, letting it go isn't actually kindness. It's just avoidance. And it's costing you something real every time someone treats you like you need rescuing when you don't." I sat with that observation for a long time afterward, understanding, even as I continued choosing silence for the time being, that Daniel had named something true about the actual cost of my avoidance that I hadn't fully let myself examine. 2 weeks before this story reaches its turning point, our extended family gathered for a cousin's graduation party, a large gathering that included aunts, uncles, and cousins who saw our immediate family only a handful of times each year, relying heavily, in the intervals between visits, on whatever narrative our parents had most recently offered about each of their children's lives. I want to describe the specific moment that finally broke the pattern, because it happened almost accidentally, without either Ethan or me planning any kind of confrontation in advance. Our Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, approached Ethan during a lull in the party, genuinely curious, apparently, about a narrative she'd been hearing consistently from my mother for 3 years running. "I have to say," she told him, "I think it's wonderful how generous you've been with Olivia these past few years. Not every sibling would step up like that." I want to describe Ethan's response to Aunt Carol's comment, because it represented the first time, in 3 years, that either of us had directly, publicly corrected our parents' narrative. Ethan set down the drink he'd been holding, and I watched his expression shift into something calm but entirely deliberate. "I think you've got that backwards, actually," he said. "Olivia's the one who's helped me, more than once, over the past few years. I don't know where the other version of this story came from, but it's not accurate." Aunt Carol looked genuinely confused, glancing between Ethan and me, apparently trying to reconcile this new information against 3 years of a completely different narrative she'd absorbed from our mother. "Your mom's told me multiple times that you've been supporting Olivia," she said. "I just assumed that was the situation." I want to describe something Aunt Carol shared later that same conversation, because I think it added an unexpected layer of context to why she'd absorbed our mother's narrative so completely, without ever thinking to question it. "I think part of why I never doubted it," she told us, once the initial shock had settled somewhat, "is that your mother's always been so specific and consistent about it. It wasn't a vague comment here and there. She'd bring it up with real detail, how proud she was of Ethan for stepping up, how she hoped you'd find your footing soon. That kind of specificity makes a story feel true, even when it isn't." I found this observation genuinely useful, understanding, for the first time, part of why the false narrative had spread so effectively and persisted so long without correction. It hadn't been a single vague rumor. It had been a specific, detailed, repeatedly reinforced story, delivered with the particular confidence of someone who genuinely believed what she was saying, which made it considerably more convincing to anyone hearing it secondhand than a more hesitant or vague characterization might have been. "I don't think your mother was trying to hurt you," Aunt Carol added. "I think she genuinely believed this version. That almost makes it more unsettling, honestly, imagining how confidently untrue information can spread when the person sharing it doesn't even realize they're wrong." What happened next, I want to describe carefully, because it's the specific moment that transformed a private correction into something considerably more definitive. "I can actually show you," Ethan said, pulling out his phone. "I know this is a strange thing to prove, but I think it matters, given how long this other version has apparently been going around." He opened his banking app, scrolling through several months of transaction history, and turned the screen toward Aunt Carol. I want to describe what that screen actually showed, because the specificity matters. 3 separate transfers from my account to his, each labeled clearly with a note, "Rent help, March," for the deposit, spanning the 18-month period of his unemployment and subsequent apartment move. Below those, a series of smaller, regular transfers, repayments Ethan had sent back to me over the following year, each one also clearly labeled. "This is the actual record," Ethan told her. "I don't know how the other story started, but this is what's actually happened between us financially for the past 3 years." Aunt Carol stared at the phone for a long moment, genuinely processing what she was seeing, before looking up at both of us with an expression of visible discomfort. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would your mother tell everyone the opposite of what actually happened?" I want to be honest that this was, essentially, the exact question I'd been sitting with privately for 3 years, one I still didn't have a fully satisfying answer to, even standing there with the actual evidence finally visible. "I don't think Mom's ever really updated her idea of either of us," I said, finally speaking directly to the situation for the first time. I think she decided, a long time ago, which of us needed help and which of us provided it, and nothing that's actually happened since has changed that story in her head. I want to describe how this correction spread through the rest of the party, because the specific mechanics of it mattered to how thoroughly the false narrative was eventually undone. Aunt Carol, understandably troubled by what she'd learned, mentioned it to my uncle within the hour, who mentioned it, in turn, to my cousin, the general. Informal way information travels through a large family gathering once something genuinely surprising has been introduced. By the time the party was winding down, several relatives had approached either Ethan or me directly, expressing a specific mixture of confusion and, in some cases, mild embarrassment about comments they'd made over the years based on the false narrative our mother had been circulating. One cousin told me directly that she'd assumed, based on years of our mother's comments, that I'd been going through some kind of ongoing financial struggle, and had felt genuinely sorry for me without ever having any actual basis for that sympathy beyond what she'd been told secondhand. My Uncle Frank, Aunt Carol's husband, approached me directly about an hour after the initial revelation, his expression carrying a specific, genuine discomfort I hadn't anticipated from someone I didn't know especially well. "I need to apologize for something," he told me. "Last year, at your cousin's wedding, I made a comment to you about being glad you'd found your footing with Ethan's help. I remember you just kind of nodded and didn't say much. I understand now why. I'm sorry I said something so presumptuous, based on nothing but what your mother had told everyone." I told him I appreciated the apology, though I admitted, honestly, that I hadn't even fully remembered that specific comment among the many similar ones I'd absorbed over the years without correction. "It's strange," I told him. "There have been so many small moments like that, I think I stopped registering each one individually. It just became a kind of background hum I'd learned to tune out." "That sounds exhausting," he said. I'm glad Ethan finally said something. I don't think any of us would have known otherwise. I want to describe the conversation Ethan and I eventually had with our mother, later that same evening, once the party had ended and family members had begun departing. "Mom," Ethan said, finding her in the kitchen helping clean up, "I need to ask you something. Why have you been telling everyone, for 3 years, that I've been supporting Olivia financially, when it's actually been the other way around?" Our mother's face shifted through several expressions, initial confusion, then a specific defensiveness I recognized from decades of similar conversations. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I've just said you two help each other out." "That's not what you've been saying," I told her, finding my own voice now. "Aunt Carol just told us, directly, that you've described me as the one depending on Ethan, repeatedly, for years." "That's not accurate, Mom. I've helped Ethan financially more than he's helped me, and Ethan just showed her the actual bank records to prove it." I want to describe the rest of this confrontation in more detail, because I think the specific back and forth mattered to how genuinely, or not, our mother initially processed what we were telling her. "I don't see why this is such a big deal," she said, her defensiveness hardening rather than softening as the conversation continued. "You two help each other. Does it really matter which direction the money went in any given month? It matters because you told an entire extended family, for 3 years, that I was the one who couldn't manage on my own," I said. "That's not a neutral detail, Mom. That's a specific characterization of my competence and my independence, repeated to dozens of people, that turned out to be the opposite of true." "I never said you couldn't manage," she said. "I just said Ethan helped you." "You said I needed to get back on my feet," I told her. "You said I was finally becoming more self-sufficient, during the exact month I was covering his rent." Those aren't neutral descriptions. Those are judgments about my capability, stated as fact, to people who had no way of knowing they were wrong. Ethan, standing beside me, added his own voice to the confrontation. "I think what's hardest for me," he said, "is that you were saying this while I was actually struggling, during my unemployment. You had a front row seat to what was actually happening, and you still told everyone something different." Our mother was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a specific quality that suggested some genuine, if incomplete, reckoning with what she'd apparently been doing without fully examining it herself. "I think I just always assumed you needed more help," she said. You changed careers so many times in your 20s, and Ethan seemed to settle into things so much more easily. I think I built a story about both of you a long time ago, and I never really checked whether it was still true. It was never fully true even at the time, I told her. But it's definitely not true now, and it hasn't been for years. I need you to understand how much harm this caused, letting people believe something false about me, for years, without ever once checking with either of us whether it was accurate. I don't know how to undo 3 years of telling people something, our mother said, her voice carrying genuine distress now rather than simple defensiveness. You can start by telling the truth going forward, Ethan told her. And honestly, at the next family gathering, correcting it directly with the people who heard the wrong version. I don't think there's a way to make this disappear completely, but you can stop letting it continue. Our mother nodded slowly, though I want to be honest that I didn't feel any immediate, complete resolution in that moment, simply the beginning of a conversation that would need considerably more follow-through than a single evening's admission to actually repair the years of false narrative she'd allowed to circulate. I want to address, briefly, our father's role in all of this, because I think his specific passivity throughout the 3 years mattered almost as much as our mother's active mischaracterization. Our father had never been the one actively spreading the narrative, but he'd also never once corrected it, even when he'd been present for conversations where our mother described our financial relationship inaccurately. When I raised this with him directly, a few days after the party, his response was characteristically understated. I guess I never thought much about it, he said. Your mother talks about you both a lot, and I don't always catch every detail of what she's actually saying. I told him, plainly, that his passive acceptance of an inaccurate narrative, over years, had allowed real harm to accumulate, regardless of his own lack of active participation in creating it. He seemed to genuinely absorb this, promising, going forward, to correct the narrative himself if he ever heard it repeated inaccurately again. I want to describe a specific instance, several weeks later, where my father actually demonstrated the follow-through he'd promised, because I think it mattered to me considerably more than his initial, somewhat passive acknowledgement had. At a smaller family dinner, a distant cousin mentioned, in passing, having heard that Ethan had really come through for me over the past few years. Before I could decide whether to correct this myself, my father spoke up directly. Actually, I think you've got that backwards, he said, echoing almost exactly the same phrase Ethan had used at the graduation party. Olivia's been the one helping Ethan, more than the other way around. I don't know where the other version came from, but it's not accurate, and I want to make sure it stops getting repeated. I remember feeling a specific, quiet surprise at hearing my father volunteer this correction unprompted, without needing me or Ethan to raise it first. It was a small moment, but it represented, I think, exactly the kind of active correction I'd asked him for, rather than his previous pattern of simply not participating in the harm without actively working to undo it either. Thank you for saying something, I told him afterward, genuinely moved by the gesture. I know that's not really your instinct, jumping into a conversation like that. I told you I would, he said, simply. I meant it. The next significant family gathering, several months later, gave me a clear measure of whether anything had actually changed since that difficult evening at the graduation party. I want to describe what was different, because the specifics matter more than a general assurance that things improved. My mother, unprompted, brought up the topic herself, early in the gathering, in front of several relatives who'd been present for the earlier, incorrect version of events. I want to correct something I've apparently been saying wrong for a while, she said. Olivia's actually been the one helping Ethan out financially, more than the other way around. I got that backwards for longer than I should have. It wasn't a dramatic, tearful confession. But it was specific, public, and delivered in the same setting where the false narrative had originally circulated, exactly the kind of correction I'd needed to see before I could trust that anything had genuinely shifted rather than simply being smoothed over in private. I want to describe the broader atmosphere of that follow-up gathering, because I think the specific way relatives responded to my mother's correction mattered to how completely the false narrative was finally, definitively put to rest. Several relatives who'd been present at the earlier graduation party exchanged quiet, knowing glances as my mother spoke, a specific, silent acknowledgement among people who'd all, individually, absorbed some version of the same false narrative over the preceding years. My cousin Danielle, who'd expressed genuine sympathy toward me at an earlier gathering based on the incorrect version of events, approached me afterward with a specific warmth that felt different from her earlier, more cautious kindness. "I'm glad that got straightened out properly," she told me. "I think I'd started to feel a little strange about how I'd been thinking about you, honestly, without ever really questioning where that thinking had come from. It's a good reminder, I think, to actually ask people directly about their own lives instead of just accepting whatever version gets passed around." I appreciated her reflection, understanding it as a small but genuine sign that the correction had done more than simply resolve an isolated misunderstanding. It had prompted at least some relatives to reconsider, more broadly, how readily they'd accepted second-hand characterizations without ever seeking out the actual truth directly. I want to describe, honestly, how my relationship with my mother evolved in the months following this incident, because I think the gradual, uneven nature of that evolution matters more than a clean, simple resolution would. She's made, to her credit, a specific, sustained effort to ask more direct questions rather than relying on assumptions she'd settled into years earlier, checking in genuinely about my actual financial situation, my actual career progress, rather than filtering new information through an outdated narrative she'd never bothered to update. I don't think the underlying tendency toward quick, settled judgments about her children has fully disappeared. I noticed, at a more recent gathering, a brief moment where she started to characterize a decision of mine in a way that echoed the old pattern, before catching herself, visibly, and asking a genuine follow-up question instead. I said nothing about that flicker, choosing instead to notice and appreciate the visible correction. Several months after the initial confrontation, my mother and I had a longer, more reflective conversation, one that went further than her initial defensive response had allowed for, into the actual roots of why she'd settled into such a specific, calcified narrative about each of her children. "I think I've spent my whole life comparing you two," she admitted, during this conversation, her voice carrying a genuine vulnerability I rarely heard from her. "I think, somewhere early on, I decided Ethan was the reliable one and you were the one who needed more support, and once I'd decided that, I think I just kept looking for evidence that confirmed it, rather than actually paying attention to what either of you were actually doing as adults." "Why do you think you needed that story in the first place?" I asked her, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. She was quiet for a long moment. "I think it made me feel like I understood my own children," she said. "Like I had a clear picture of who each of you were, instead of having to keep updating that picture constantly as you both grew and changed. I think that clear picture felt safer to hold on to than the messy truth of actually paying close attention." I appreciated this admission considerably more than her earlier, more defensive response, understanding it as a genuine attempt to examine the actual psychological root of a pattern that had caused real, if unintended, harm over 3 years. I want to describe what Ethan and I, specifically, took away from this experience, given how directly our relationship as siblings was implicated in the whole ordeal. "I think we should have corrected this years ago," Ethan told me, not long after the graduation party. "I don't know why we both just let it sit there for so long, being wrong." "I think we both know why," I told him. "Correcting Mom about anything has never felt worth the energy it takes. But I think this taught me that letting something fall stand, indefinitely, has its own cost too, even if that cost is quieter than the cost of confrontation." We agreed, going forward, to correct inaccurate narratives directly and promptly, understanding, from this experience, exactly how much a false story can calcify and spread if left unaddressed for long enough. I want to describe a conversation I had with my therapist, several weeks after the graduation party, because I think it helped me understand something important about why I'd allowed this specific pattern to continue for so long, beyond simply the practical exhaustion of confrontation. "I think there's something deeper here," she told me, once I'd walked her through the whole situation. "You've described, in previous sessions, a general pattern of accepting your parents' characterizations of you rather than pushing back, going back to childhood. I wonder if this specific situation is really about the money at all, or whether it's about a much older pattern of letting other people's assessment of you stand, unchallenged, because challenging it as a child never felt safe or effective." I sat with that observation for a long time, understanding, with a specific clarity I hadn't fully had before, that my 3 years of silence about the financial narrative had likely been sustained by considerably older patterns than just this one situation, a lifetime of learning, correctly or not, that correcting my parents rarely produced anything but more friction, and that accepting their version of events, even when wrong, had once felt like the safer, easier path. I think recognizing that pattern is useful, she told me, not because it means you should have confronted your mother sooner, necessarily, but because it might help you notice, going forward, when you're accepting a characterization of yourself that isn't actually true, simply because correcting it feels harder than living with it. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I confronted my mother immediately, the first time I noticed the false narrative beginning, rather than letting it continue for 3 years. I didn't, and I think it's more honest to say so, even though the cleaner, more proactive version might feel more satisfying to imagine. What actually happened was more human and more complicated. A false story, rooted in an early, unexamined assumption, persisted for years simply because correcting it felt exhausting, and because I'd learned, from decades of experience, that direct confrontation with my mother rarely produced genuine change. It took an accidental, unplanned moment, Aunt Carol's innocent comment, Ethan's decision to finally correct it, for years of quiet inaccuracy to finally be definitively resolved. I used to think letting a false narrative stand, quietly, was the path of least resistance, a reasonable trade-off against the exhaustion of constant correction. I've since learned that silence has its own accumulating cost, one that eventually requires a considerably larger reckoning than the smaller, earlier corrections I'd avoided along the way. I found myself, in the months since this happened, sharing a version of this story with several friends navigating their own complicated family narratives about money, achievement, or capability that seemed to persist independent of actual, changing reality. Correct it early, even when it feels exhausting, I tell them. I let a false story about my own financial independence circulate for 3 years because confronting it felt like more effort than it was worth. But the actual cost of that silence, years of relatives believing something false about me, without any basis in reality, ended up being considerably higher than the discomfort of an earlier, smaller correction would have been. I want to describe one specific conversation from this period, because a friend I shared this story with offered a perspective that genuinely challenged how I'd been thinking about the whole situation. "I get why you're telling this like a clean lesson now," she told me, "but I want to push back a little. I don't think the answer is always correct everything immediately. Sometimes the exhaustion of constant correction really is a legitimate reason to let something go, at least for a while. I think what actually mattered here wasn't that you waited 3 years, it's that you and Ethan eventually corrected it together, thoroughly, with actual proof, rather than just picking at it a little every time it came up and never fully resolving it." I sat with her perspective for a while, understanding that it offered a genuinely useful complication to the simpler lesson I'd initially drawn from this experience. "I think that's fair," I told her. "I don't think I'd tell someone to fight every single mischaracterization the moment it happens. I think I'd tell them to pay attention to when the cost of silence starts outweighing the cost of confrontation, and to trust that instinct once it arrives, rather than defaulting endlessly to whichever feels easier in any given moment." My relationship with Ethan today remains exactly as close as it's always been, strengthened, in some ways, by having navigated this strange, protracted misunderstanding together and finally corrected it as a team rather than separately. My relationship with my parents exists in a more honest, if still evolving, form, my mother considerably more careful now about checking assumptions before repeating them publicly, my father somewhat more willing to correct inaccuracies he notices rather than letting them pass unaddressed. I don't know if either of them will ever fully break the habit of settling into early, calcified narratives about their children. But I know, now, that I won't let a false version of my own life stand indefinitely, regardless of how much easier silence might feel in any given moment. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I carry with me now every time I think about that graduation party, the specific moment Ethan pulled out his phone and, without any dramatic confrontation, simply showed our aunt the plain, documented truth of 3 years of transfers running in the opposite direction from what everyone had been told. The actual record of what happened, kept honestly over years without any particular expectation of needing it as proof, ended up mattering considerably more than any argument either of us could have made in the moment. I don't think Ethan pulled out his phone that day planning to correct 3 years of family narrative. I think he simply understood, in that moment, that the truth was easy to show, once someone finally asked the right question. I want to close with one more specific moment, a conversation Ethan and I had over dinner about 6 months after all of this had settled into its new, more honest shape. "I've thought about this a lot," he told me, turning his glass slowly on the table between us. "I think what actually bothers me most, looking back, isn't even that Mom got it backward. It's that neither of us said anything, for 3 years, even though we both noticed it separately, long before Aunt Carol ever asked that question at the party." "I've thought about that too," I told him. "I think we both got comfortable with a specific kind of quiet, the kind that feels like keeping the peace but is actually just avoiding something uncomfortable. I don't think either of us is entirely to blame for that. I think it's just what happens when you've spent decades learning that pushing back on Mom rarely goes anywhere good." "I don't want to keep doing that, though," Ethan said. "Not just with Mom. I think I want to get better, generally, at saying things out loud sooner, even when it's uncomfortable, rather than waiting for some accidental moment to force it into the open." I told him I felt exactly the same way, understanding, in that specific dinner conversation, that the real, lasting lesson from this entire situation wasn't really about our parents at all. It was about the two of us, and the specific, quiet habit we'd both fallen into of letting things go unaddressed simply because addressing them felt harder than living with the discomfort of silence. I don't know if my mother fully understands, even now, exactly how a small, early assumption calcified into 3 years of an entirely false story about her own children. But I know that the actual truth, patient, documented, and finally spoken plainly in the same room where the false version had lived for so long, settled the matter completely, the moment it was finally given the chance to. If you've ever let a false story about you stand because correcting it felt exhausting, I'd love to hear how you eventually addressed it, and what finally made you decide to. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.